Hello everyone and welcome to a really wonderful game from the 1924 tournament that we played in New York between Jose Raul Capablanca and Savielly Tartakower. You guys requested I show a game as today is the 80th anniversary of Jose Raul Capablanca. So like every year on Women's Day we show a game by the Cuban master, and what better way than to show a game where he truly outshines his opponent in the end game, because he was often about simplicity. He was often about just winning the games in the simplest possible way. And he said that, okay, maybe when you start learning chess, you might be eager to really dive into the openings, but then once the opening phase is over, your opponent will just outplay you. Or if you just study the middle game, then you will make some mistakes in the opening. You're going to have a bad middle game. And if you have not studied the end game at all, then you're gonna just get outplayed by your opponent. So he says that you should start by studying the end game, then you should dive into the middle game, and only in the end you should study the opening in depth. Of course, you have to know some basics of the opening to be able to play, but not like some crazy super engine line of the Gioco Piano up to maybe 25 moves. But you have to know that you don't start with h4 h5, or if you do, if that's your style, that's also cool. But you have to know why you're doing it. So here we're going to show a very nice game, and explain it with some of our own ideas, with Capablanca's ideas, also following up by ideas of Alekhine and Reti. So you guys will enjoy this one a lot, I believe. So Capablanca with the white pieces opens with d4. We have e6 by Tartakower, knight to f3 and f5, going for the Horwitz defense, but after c4 we transpose into the Dutch defense. We have knight to f6 and the bishop to g5. So every move a development, bishop to e7 and knight to c3. We have castles by Tartakower and now e3, preparing to develop the light square bishop. b6, as black already played f5, he has a very firm grip on the e4 square. He wants to play bishop to b7, gain more control. Not that, over the e4 square, and then hopefully at some point put a knight on e4 and, maybe trade off the knight for knight, trade off the bishop for bishop. So that's basically black's plan. So here we have bishop to d3, Capablanca continues developing, bishop to b7, and now castles. We have queen to e8, now preparing to shift the queen over to the king's side, and now queen to e2. Capablanca develops the queen, connects the rooks, and it is now already, as of move 9, that this position has never been reached again. And black says, all right, now it's time to go after the trades. So knight to e4, now trying to trade off everything. And here we have bishop captures on e7, and now knight captures on c3. And this capture is not really in the spirit of modern chess. Queen captures on e7 would be a little bit more precise, because you never expect white to capture here. White will try something like, when the time is right, something like knight f to d2, and then he will try to kick away your knight with f3. But this is something you should force white to do, because it weakens white's king side a little bit. It strengthens his center, but it's a trade-off. But here, if you trade, you cannot capture with the knight. If you capture with the knight, then just pawn captures, and then, well, both the knight and the bishop are attacked. So here it's very unlikely that we would see bishop captures, f captures, and then, okay, the knight has to move, knight to d2, black can strike in the center with d5, and it's a very passive for white, and black has a very clear way of what he wants to do. The queen now has access to the game, the other rook can come to f8, so it's very enjoyable for black. So maybe not going for this trade right away, but okay, knight captures on c3. This is 1924 after all, or maybe he wanted to surprise Capablanca a little bit, as Tartakower was no pushover himself. He was an extremely strong player. So b captures on c3, queen captures on e7, and now Capablanca grabs more space on the queen side with a4. And now, how do you continue this with black? Obviously, you have to continue development. You need to bring your knight into the game, your rook into the game, and but it's not all that clear how to do this. Obviously, g6 will be played at some point, but maybe something like queen to f7 if you want to try and get the queen into the attack. You could try and play an attacking game, utilizing this bishop as an attacking piece. For example, now white can play a5, you're going to play queen to g6, and you're always going to have this grip on the g2 square. But again, white can just play knight h4, kick away the queen, then play g3, and there's really no attack here. So instead, Tartakower plays something completely different here. He just wants to trade pieces against Capablanca. So he just wants to go into the endgame as soon as possible against Capablanca. So bishop captures on f3, queen captures on f3, and now knight to c6. We have to develop as our rook on a8 is hanging. So rook f to b1. Now with some ideas of maybe weakening the position with a5 or c5, depending on what black does with the knight and the queen. So rook 8 to e8, and now queen to h3. Capablanca puts some pressure on that h7 pawn, but that's not what he really wants to do. He wants to grab a firm grip over the e5 square. He wants to play f4 and then prevent black from executing e5 himself, because now if you play e5, then the f5 pawn just hang. So here we have rook to f6, preparing to bring the rook to g6 or h6, again depending on what Capablanca plays, and now f4, grabbing now the control over the e5 square. Knight to a5, Tartakower now says, alright, you will not be achieving anything on the queen side then. We have queen back to f3, and now we have d6, and this d6 move might be a little too slow, but even if you try with the more direct approach, let's say c5, you challenge the center, we're gonna play e4. Of course, you don't wanna, you could always capture here and then play something like g6 to prevent anything happening to your king, but even here, for example, c captures on d4, if e5, we're gonna move the rook, and once c captures on d4 was played, this can also definitely be played for black. So maybe c5 a little bit more precise, but okay, here we have d6, and now Capablanca brings the rook back to e1. Now he's preparing e4. We have queen to d7, getting the queen away from the e-file, and now comes pawn to e4 as planned. We have f captures on e4, queen captures on e4, now attacking h7, and the g6 now. So nothing wrong with this. This is perfectly fine for black. g3 now, adding a defender to his g3 pawn, and now king to f8. So what do you do here with white? Well, Capablanca starts by bringing the king into the game as he is preparing his pieces to enter the end game. We have rook to f7, sort of a waiting move for black, but you have to play something. Now Capablanca grabs more space on the king side. We have h4, and now d5, striking in the center. We have, or rather, you could also play knight captures on c4. It's definitely worth mentioning, because if bishop captures, then d5 gets an attack on the bishop and the queen. But here, white's plan is just to continue pushing, and now things are not looking all that great for black. We're going to have to play d5 here, and once the queen moves, it's still very, very suspicious for black on the king side, but it would definitely be a fighting idea. Here d5 was played immediately. Now Capablanca captures on d5, we have e captures on d5, and now of course, as a queen trade is offered, Capablanca accepts it because there is one very specific idea that he had in mind. So queen captures on e8, check, queen captures, rook captures on e8, king captures on e8, and now we've reached the end game where it's bishop and rook against a knight and rook. Same amount of pawns. Kings are fairly similarly active. The black king can, easily reach the center of the board. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find the idea Capablanca had and why he wanted to go into the end game at this precise moment. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations. I imagine you spend your days studying the endgame. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is pawn to h5. You could also start with rook to h1 and then pawn to h5, but it's way cooler to play h5 right away. So what do you do here? Alekhine says that, or rather in his words, this is the calamity. The rook now enters the hostile camp. And if we capture this, then just rook h1, we're going to pick up this pawn, then we're going to pick up this pawn, and then we will have a winning endgame. So instead, after h5, we have rook to f6. The rook will be much needed here, guarding the g6 square, but also it can easily be shifted to c6, going after the c3 weakness. So here we have h captures on g6, h captures, and then now, of course, rook to h1. That was Capablanca's plan. And now, what do you play here? Well, king to f8. It's a bit of a slow move, but Tartakower plays it correctly, as you are expecting the rook to come to h6, so you need to defend it with king to g7. There's no other way to defend g6, and also if something like rook to h7, you can block with rook to f7. So here Capablanca brings the rook to h7, but now not blocking with rook to f7, but going for an active sort of a active defense, rook to c6. Now attacks the c3 pawn, but Capablanca just plays g4. And now here, with pushing g4, Capablanca has a very specific position in mind that it's very hard for for black to well, to avoid. Here we have knight to c4. If you just go for rook captures on c3, then you no longer defend the g6 pawn. Capablanca will capture, and now you have two connected pass pawns. This is just resigns. So instead, after g4, we have knight to c4, and now g5. Again, black can win some pawns here, but it's not it's simply not enough. Here, knight to e3 check, we have king to f3, and now knight to f5, blocking the bishop's attack to the g6 pawn. But this is not the absolute best way to defend this position. I will show it just to give you an example of how rich the game really is. Knight to d1 is the way to go. Now the idea is, after rook to h6, going after the g6 pawn, king to g7, and now f5. That's the good stuff. Now knight to b2, going after the bishop, and now bishop back to b1. If you guys are thinking about f6, of course this doesn't work. Rook captures on f6, and you've blundered your advantage away. Captures, and you will not be winning this with white. So after the knight attacks the bishop, you're going to have to move the bishop back, and now, of course, we're going to play rook captures on c3, king g4, g captures, and now bishop captures on f5, and now with the rook, bishop, pass pawn, and king ready to jump into the game, it will be very hard for black to defend this, but it will be possible. That's what black should have done. So instead, knight to f5 was played, but now it is very, very straightforward, because here Capablanca can get the exact position he had in mind when he, probably even when he played that h5 move. So here, bishop captures on f5. Alekhine says that this is, well, just simple and compelling, and now g captures on f5. So while it's not something you can avoid recapturing, it's also completely lost for black, but it's not easy to figure out why. So feel free to pause the video and try to find the only winning move for Capablanca while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on not doing anything weird, like maybe, bringing the king back, or maybe trying to, give a check or something like that, or pushing g6, because that just blunders a pawn. And for those of you who found the move, congratulations on being a true master of the endgame, and that is king to g3. That's the good stuff, because now when you see it, of course, you also believe it. The pawn here controls the e4 and the g4 squares, and if rook captures on c3 comes with check, we're not going to be able to go up the board with the king. We're going to have to go down the board, and that's, well, that's not how you usually want to play the endgame. Sometimes it is, but most of the times it's not. So king to g3, now we have access to the game. And here we have rook captures on c3 with check, king to h4, and now rook to f3. So you can defend the pawn because the g4 square is covered by the pawn, but this is all planned by Capablanca, because he will get the position that he had in mind. g6, rook captures on f4, and now king g5 with tempo, attacking the rook, rook to e4, and now king to f6. So this is the position that Capablanca had in mind. King on f6, king on f8, the pass pawn on g6, and the rook on h7, and it's impossible to defend this. So what can you do here? Okay, king g8, we're gonna try something, but now before capturing the c7 pawn, we're gonna play rook to g6, rook to g7 first. We want the king either on h8 or on f8 to be able to deliver this g6 push with check. And Alekhine also mentions about this position, that when Capablanca started his march with the king, he of course knew that he would get this position, and that the black pawns are, in such a such a terrible position that they will tumble like ripe apples. So here, king to h8, now comes rook captures on c7. And once you see this, the king and pawn controlling all of these squares, you just know that there's no way out. We have rook to e8, of course we have to prevent checkmate, and then now comes king captures on f5. Again, simple and elegant as Capablanca usually plays, because if you go for king to f7, it will just prolong the game unnecessarily. For example, rook to d8, and now, okay, you can play rook to c1 to try and deliver checkmate this way, but now rook d7 check. And how are you getting out of checks without giving up the g8 square for the black king? You're going to have to play king e6, and once rook d8 comes, then you will capture the pawn. So instead of going all the way around, Capablanca just captures the pawn. He plays king captures on f5. We have rook to e4, now trying to go behind the white king once both the king and pawn start marching forward, but it will of course be futile. Rook to f4 check, king to e5. Now we have rook to g4 attacking the pawn, and now it seems that Tartakower solved his problems, because now the g7 square is covered twice by the rook and by the pawn, if the pawn is pushed of course. But that's exactly what Capablanca does, pawn to g7, because now even with the rooks off the board and giving up a pawn temporarily, the white king is much more active and will be able to gobble up all of the pawns. To give you an example, captures, captures, captures. We're capturing here, and look at the white king easily gobbling up all of these pawns, for example, and promoting the passed a pawn. So instead, after g7, we have king to g8, and now we have rook captures on a7. Like Alekhine said, they are dropping like ripe apples. We have rook to g1, now comes king captures on d5. We have rook to c1, now king to d6. Now the d pawn is marching forward. Rook to c2, black can only wait and see what happens. d5, rook to c1, rook to c7, now offering a rook trade, and rook a1. It's not much, but at least we will play something. King to c6, rook captures on a4, and now d6. And it was in this position on move 52 that Tartakower resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. So we will show how this is how easy it is to win this, because I know some of you really enjoy it when we play out the games until the end. For example, rook d4, we're gonna try and put a rook behind the passed pawn, just d7. And if now rook d3, we're gonna play king captures on b6, that pawn is falling whatever black does. Rook b3 check, king to c6, rook c3 check, king b7, and now again after rook d3 guarding the queening square, just king c8, and that's it. We queen the pawn on the next move, and of course we win the game easily. So yeah, there you have it, how simple the endgame is when you really understand chess. And it's something that, well, I definitely agree with, because I've never studied the openings all that much, but I have studied the endgame quite a lot. And even though when I play a classical game, I like 99% of the times I get outplayed in the opening, I get a hard position to play in the middle game, but if I reach the end game, then somehow I always survive or even triumph, as it's a really exciting part of the game. So if you like Capablanca's idea, maybe study the end game first, then enjoy some positions from the middle game, and only then, when you're rated 300, maybe you should dive deep into the openings, or maybe even higher rated. Who knows what the threshold is nowadays. So yeah, that's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and that you've learned not the end game, but that you've learned maybe to appreciate the end game a little more. So there's that. I would like to thank, congrats for the new job, Elizabeth Ikoko Meow Meow. Greetings from Zdravko Bus, Zulong, Clothbox.com, and Lucas Teokaris for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Grand Prix until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.